All right. Well, let me start by saying you don't have to do it perfectly for it to be a good thing. You can do vermicomposting in a 5-gallon bucket in your basement. What is it you need to get started? A bucket, household waste, and worms, and an environment where they're not going to freeze forever.
You're listening to How I Grow This, exploring stories of gardeners from across the globe as we learn from their biggest tips and tricks to some of the things not to do. I'm your host, Luke Hammond. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the How I Grow This podcast. I'm your host, Luke Hammond. I'm so excited to be joined with my friend, Steve Churchill from the Urban Worm Company. I have personally used a lot of their products. I have really enjoyed my whole vermicomposting journey, and today you're going to learn something new. I guarantee it, unless you're like the worm expert of all worm experts. But you probably will still learn something new. Welcome to the How I Grow This podcast, Steve.
Thanks Luke. Good to see you again.
Yeah. I think this is really interesting because we are particularly a gardening podcast. We talk about gardening and growing, and like the first thing you say is not a gardener, hands up in the air, not a gardener. So
right.
I want to hear a little bit about your story because you're in kind of the gardening space-ish. And the Urban Worm Company helps so many different people really handle a problem. And so I want you to talk about that, talk about your story. It's a very interesting story. I love telling your story to other people. So why don't you go ahead and dive in there?
Yeah, so I think you've kind of alluded to it. I'm one of the last people you think would be getting into a worm farming or even gardening adjacent type of business. I'm a retired Air Force pilot, current airline pilot for Southwest Airlines. And, that tends not to be a real green crowd. So we'll come back to that here in a second. But really what it came down to was in 2011, we moved out from South Philadelphia out to the suburbs up here in a little town called Plymouth Meeting. It's a Philadelphia suburb. We ended up with a little over an acre, which out here is considered land. It's not considered land in most part of the country, but in most parts of the country. But here, it's a good amount of property, and on that property we have a barn. And so we're just kind of like, hey, we have a barn. Let's do barny things. And my wife said, let's make a compost pile. And so I tried to teach myself a little bit about composting. One of the first things I did was just pile up a bunch of leaves and let them sit there and thinking something is going to happen. And that's not really how composting works. So ended up going to a local convenience store. If people are familiar with like Buc-ee's or Sheetz or other parts of the country, we have something up here called Wawa, which has like the 12 different kinds of coffee. And so they throw away a whole bunch of coffee grounds, which are high in nitrogen, which is what I needed for my compost pile. So I brought back a whole lot of coffee grounds, mixed them up with those leaves, watered it down, and boom, the pile fired up, probably within 2 to 3 days, got up to over 150 degrees. And I was fascinated with that. The thing I was fascinated by was toward the end of the summer, I noticed that all of these worms had moved in. And this is after the pile had kind of started cooling a little bit, gone through that heating phase for composting. And I was really fascinated by how these worms further fragmented that pile into something that actually started looking like coffee grounds again, not just compost, clumpy compost, but really fragmented coffee grounds. My wife said, well, those are worm castings. And then I was like, what are worm castings? And then just started down this other rabbit hole. But I've always also had an entrepreneurial streak, and this is where the business side of it comes in. Over the next couple of years, I taught myself how to do vermicomposting. I was fascinated by the process. But I also noticed that there weren't a whole lot of sources online. There were a few, but not a whole lot of sources online. We're not doing a great job of telling the story of vermicomposting, how to do it at home, and how to. So I wanted to be able to teach people in a way that I wish I was taught. And so I started a blog, called it the Urban Worm Company, thinking, well, let's at least not call it the Urban Worm blog. Let's call it the Urban Worm Company, just in case something can happen. And really, my intent at the time was to get into blogging, teach people how to do vermicomposting, and use that skill of writing internet content and doing that search engine optimization and all those buzzwords, that I would eventually use when the real idea came along. And the real idea never really came along after that. I kept vermicomposting. I sort of got a foothold in the industry. People started trusting what I had to say. And then it just kind of grew from there. And as the business grew, my knowledge continued to grow, and my passion, which started out not really as a passion, but more of a curiosity, just sort of blossomed into, hey, I'm onto something here. This was back when, before we were using the terms regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture was still very much on the rise. We're talking 2014 at this point. And so it just sort of kept growing. And I said, I think I actually like this stuff. This is not just an entrepreneurial, I think there's something here. And then, COVID happened, and COVID obviously was a big accelerant for anything to do with gardening, anything to do with being outdoors, getting your hands dirty, people getting back to the earth. And then it was kind of off to the races from there. Since COVID, we've continued to grow. It didn't grow like we did during COVID. But we started off really, again, with the education for the home vermicomposter, moved into products for the home vermicomposter, but then got into larger scale stuff. And we now supply close to 1 million pounds a year of worm castings for our customers. So the business has kind of evolved over time, but yeah, it started out as just a blog, turned into an actual business almost by accident, and getting back to the airline.
A guy with some leaves and coffee grounds.
Exactly. Yeah. And getting back to tying it all back to the airline pilot thing, I say it's my penance for burning fossil fuel for a living. So,
hey,
I'm doing what I can.
There you go.
Yeah.
So 1 million pounds of earthworm castings. How big of a pile is 1 million pounds? Like, how much is that?
Well, worm castings are pretty dense. So every cubic yard is over 1,000 pounds of worm casting. So you can do the math there. Is that 1,000 times 1,000 is 1 million. So that would be, we're not probably going to get quite to 1 million, but we get pretty close each year with about 1 million pounds. So you're talking about close to 1,000 cubic yards, maybe 800 to 1,000 cubic yards of worm castings a year.
That's pretty significant. If you think of it, what is it, 26 pallets on a truck?
26 pallets on a truck, but because it's so heavy, we can only fit 19. So we got space on the truck. We run out of weight on the truck per the highway limits, than we do on the,
Yeah.
So
I was just trying to think of space-wise for people to grasp, 26 of these units fit on one tractor trailer load.
Yep.
On the freeway. Very cool.
If you could fit them all by weight, but you can't fit them all because the truck gets too heavy. Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, I got to ask this question because I know we're talking worm castings. We're talking, your history with the Air Force and all this stuff. Now, are you paid by Southwest to spray chemicals on all of us? I'm just kidding.
I have no chemicals to spray on anybody. Yeah.
Just kidding. So what is the mist or the jet trails that you see coming off of the airplane? What is that?
Well, they're not chemtrails, but they are contrails, which are produced at a certain altitude and temperature. Well, it's really not the altitude that matters. It's the temperature and the humidity of the air that interact a certain way that crystallizes the hot air that's coming out of the back of the engines. And so that's why you would see typically two trails coming out of the back of a 2-engine aircraft. Just to take the conspiracy out of this, fighter pilots call that altitude that I was talking about the marking level. That you don't want to fly through that because then you are much more visually seen by the enemy. So that whole thing is a real thing. Chemtrails are not real. Those things are just
is the Earth flat or is the Earth round? I mean, we have to get to this now that we're grounded with the earthworm casting.
The Earth is very
just
round
kidding.
Too.
Just kidding. There was a little bit of humor there.
Any more conspiracy theories you want to? I haven't seen any UFOs either.
Do you fly into the Denver airport?
I do. I do all
Are
the
there
time.
secret tunnels all the way through the Denver airport?
There's some weird stuff about the Denver airport. It's they've got some weird iconography around there. It's something to do with the Freemasons and the Illuminati or something. But I don't really think there's anything there. But I think that they are happy to have the lore be there. Yeah, I don't think there's anything nefarious going on in Denver either.
Oh man, you're crushing my
I'm
dreams.
killing you.
All right. Well, you started this blog, and let's get down into the dirt level. Okay. I think most people, but as we get to the dirt level, I want to get to what problem are we facing as a society that puts most of their food waste and brown material into a landfill?
Right.
What problem are we facing there, and what benefit would we be seeing if we were not doing that?
Right. So you're getting to what I call the input benefits of vermicomposting. So you've of course got the output benefits, which are the worm castings, which do solve some environmental problems. But then the problem that you're talking about is the issue of taking green waste, nitrogen-rich green waste, and sending it to the landfill. Landfills are a huge source of methane gas. Everybody talks about carbon dioxide. It's the easiest one to talk about. There's just so much of it in the atmosphere. The much worse gas is methane. And when you send food waste to the landfill, it's gonna rot and emit methane, which traps 85 times the heat of carbon dioxide. So it is significant. It has a much shorter life, so it doesn't persist in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide does. But 85 times the heat is trapped with methane than with carbon dioxide. So the other thing too is when you are say throwing this waste away, and this doesn't have to be just a household; it could be a business. If you are sending this stuff away, you're typically putting it in a fossil fuel burning truck, which is heavy, and it's heavy because of the water content. And then you're sending it off to the landfill to make methane. So if you can keep that stuff on property the way that a homeowner ought to be able to, especially somebody with a house that's got maybe some space outside, if you can compost or vermicompost that stuff at home, you're saving the methane, you're saving the weight going to the truck, and you're saving that fossil fuel that the truck has to burn in order to get that waste to the landfill. So that is reason enough alone. Even if you threw the worm castings away or just gave them to a neighbor, it's still a worthy endeavor.
Yeah. I think I often miss that side of things, because most people that don't know the story of that, they're probably just going to assume, well, isn't that a good nitrogen source to help break down the landfill? Because doesn't the landfill have to break down the stuff somehow? But at the same time, what in the landfill can break down?
Right. I mean, you are letting things rot, emit methane, because it's not like in the landfill, there's a whole lot of great carbon sources for that nitrogen to interact with to do the composting, which is an aerobic process. The end product of not the end product, but the gas emitted by composting is carbon dioxide. It's not methane. So it's made aerobically in most cases. So yeah, that's what we're trying to prevent there.
I love it. So we're fixing a waste problem within our own home, and we're solving a global issue with the amount of methane gas that's being emitted from both trucking and landfills, and everything in between in that process. And so we get down to the issue of, well, this is just going to be a gross, stinky mess in my house, and it's going to take up too much time. That's usually where somebody's going to hit the wall. I don't have time for that. What does it look like to get started, and what kind of time commitment, financial commitment would somebody expect if they're like, you know what, I don't want to be a part of the problem. I just want to deal with my food waste in this way.
Right. Well, let me start by saying you don't have to do it perfectly for it to be a good thing. So you typically want if we're talking vermicomposting instead of just composting, you're typically going to want your worm farm or your worm bin to be protected from the elements, not be subject to crazy low or crazy high, and crazy high temperatures are really much more the killer. But when it comes down to it, worms, we are just having worms do what they kind of naturally do in nature. Now we can talk specifically about composting worms, but you can do vermicomposting in a 5-gallon bucket, under your patio or in your basement. I like the basement's a lot better than your patio. And really you've already got the materials that the worms need to eat. You're going to have non-dairy, non-meat food waste. You're going to have paper waste, shredded. You've got Amazon boxes. So you shred those Amazon boxes and your junk mail, mix it with your food waste. And ultimately that stuff is going to become soil with the help of worms and the microbes that are assisting them in that process. So most people have a 5-gallon bucket at home, and that is how you can start. If you just want to get started right away, you could buy a Rubbermaid bin, a 10-gallon tote can do it. And really the only financial investment that you have to have at first is buying the worms. And these are specifically composting worms. We're talking red wigglers, European night crawlers, African night crawlers. Those are the three most common that you would buy. And they tend to be expensive. They're a little more expensive after COVID. You're talking about if you're getting about a pound, you're going to pay at least $50 in most cases. But that should include delivery. But that's the only thing you have to do. You could get a little fancier with something like our urban worm bag, which is a flow through. We can talk about just real quickly what the urban worm bag is. It opens at the top where you can put your food waste and the other paper waste in, and it will also open at the bottom where you can collect the worm casting. So composting worms tend to work in the top 8 to 12 inches of their habitat. So you really want to be feeding from the top, and then they will move up into those layers of fresher waste. And then a few months later, you can start opening up the bottom and taking the worm castings out without disturbing that ecosystem of worms and microbes that are doing the hard work above. But again, to your point about what is it you need to get started, a bucket, household waste, and worms, and an environment where they're not gonna get
burn or
cooked
freeze. Yeah.
Or freeze forever.
Wow. So you mentioned these 4 different kinds. Is there any sort of advantage or disadvantage to these different kinds of worms? I know you guys provide all of these different kinds of worms, but what do most people do first off? And then let's just start there. Like what's the best worm choice for a person?
I think so. Red wigglers, which are Eisenia fetida, that's the worm that I would recommend most people start with, unless there is some reason not to. The European night crawler, just so you know, the reason I say this is the red wiggler has the widest tolerance for temperature, and that's mainly the thing that we're talking about. African night crawlers need it to be a little bit warmer. They like temperatures of 77 degrees. That's where they do best. And they really don't tolerate temperatures of 55 degrees or lower very well at all. European night crawlers, on the other hand, like things a little bit cooler. They can still get up into the 90, 95 degrees before there's a problem. And I'm talking about the temperature in the vermicompost, not the outside temperature, which we can talk about that distinction. But the red wiggler just tends to have the widest range where it can operate. So I call it the Honda Accord of
Gotcha.
composting worms. It's just the best for the most amount of people. It's the 4-door sedan.
Gotcha. Now, if you go to the bait and tackle shop and you're getting these big old long, like fishing worms in a little styrofoam container with a little bit of medium in there, and there's probably, a counted out amount of 10 worms or something.
Right.
Why are they in the cooler if that's too cold? And secondly, is that the night crawler that people would be purchasing?
Right. That would most likely be a Canadian night crawler, which is a fishing worm, and that it operates in a much different way than composting worms. So composting worms are what are called epigeic. There's 3 categories of worms. There's epigeic, endogeic, and anesic. And starting from the top, the epigeic worms are the kind of worms that actually don't really live in soil. They live in the loose layers of organic matter, like manure and like leaves on the forest floor. They they don't burrow vertically. They're not very muscular worms at all. Even the ones that are called night crawlers, like the African night crawler, European night crawler. Then you've got the endogeeic, which are really more horizontal burrowers in the topsoil. And then you've got the anesic worms, which is what you're talking about with those Canadian night crawlers with the spade-shaped tails. Those are vertical burrowers. And the thing is with the vertical burrowers and the horizontal burrowers, they don't like living in close proximity to one another. So if you put a whole bunch of them in a bucket, and thinking that you're going to compost with them, they're not going to find your food that tasty. And they're not going to reproduce, because they don't really like they will not swarm food the same way that epigeic worms will. So a lot of people do go to the bait store, think that they're getting worms that are going to do composting, but they don't work like that. You really need to be in those very few worms, red wigglers, European night crawlers, and African night crawlers in order to do vermicomposting.
So for somebody wanting to get started with bait tackle worms or whatever, it's a completely different process of how their inputs, design, all that kind of stuff should be, right? They got to think of it as two separate programs entirely.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
The breeding of those fishing worms, I actually don't know how it's done. I think there's a place in Tennessee that's got it figured out. But it is different than breeding composting worms, which thankfully is much easier.
Yeah. I think they call that AI, right?
I don't know. You tell me.
Sorry, that's a bad cattle joke to artificial insemination.
Okay.
Moving on. All right. So the biggest purchase is these worms initially. I'm thinking, from a communal standpoint, the traveling Amish sourdough bag? They scrape off the waste of a sourdough container and then they give it to a friend with the instructions on how to do it. And then it just keeps multiplying out. Like maybe you can reach out on social media to somebody in your area and say, is there any hobby worm people in my backyard or in my neighborhood that we can share worms? Can I buy a worm? Maybe a couple thousand, maybe a pound. Is that a thing? Could that be a thing?
There are people on Facebook that will happily share worms with you. You just have to find them. And the thing is, we're not talking about a really popular hobby for millions and millions of people. Where can you go golfing with me tomorrow? This is like,
you want to share worms?
You want to share? Can you share? First, you have to find out where these people are, and so you'd be lucky if there was somebody within a mile radius of you that was also doing worm composting that you could find out who they are and then make contact with them. But look, there are some people, and there are parts of the country that seem to adopt this more readily. I think the South, North Carolina and South, there's a lot of worm composters down there, but whether they're willing to share their worms or not, I'm not sure.
And also make sure you specify composting worms so you don't get some really weird person trying to give you parasites or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So I want to move a little bit into this process. You said that you can literally just shred Amazon boxes, paper waste. I mean, I'm sure anybody can go outside and find leaves this time of year, no matter where you're at. Even in Arizona, you could probably find some sort of leaf material. Whether or not that leaf material is good in Arizona with a bunch of thorns and other things, that might be the question. But how would somebody start to finish get this started?
So I'm glad you mentioned leaves. The one thing that actually helps sort of kickstart a new worm farm would be the use of a already fragmented or fragmenting living material. It's already got microbes, might have some fungi in there. It's material that is already breaking down quickly, which will actually accelerate the decomposition of other things in the bin, like the paper waste and cardboard waste and whatnot, as well as the food. So I think that if you start with a diverse mix of carbon-rich material, or material that's not prone to rotting, is maybe a better way of putting it. So we're talking paper, we're talking cardboard, compost, peat moss, cocoa core. What I really love is leaf mold. There's actually a commercially available product called pit moss, PITT moss, that I think is a great starter material. You can think of these things like starter logs for a fire. It's much easier to start a worm bin that way. And then from then on, you don't really need to add it anymore. You can just add the paper waste and the cardboard waste because you've got that ecosystem of the worms and microbes doing the work for you. So that is really how I would start. Find a nice, diverse mix of those materials, stick them together, make sure that they are wet, and I wouldn't say wet, but moist to a point where if you pick the stuff up and you squeeze it really hard, you're going to get about a drop coming out between your knuckles. That is a great moisture level to start with. And from then you can start adding food waste. And what I would do is add food waste and some more of that carbon rich waste as you go. You really can't have too much of that carbon rich material, that brown material we also call bedding, in a worm farm. That's not really going to hurt anything. Where you get hurt is when you start a worm farm and then all you do is add nothing but food waste, that nitrogen rich food waste, because then you are going to do what happens in the landfill, except you're just going to do it on a much smaller scale. Is that stuff's going to start rotting. It's going to be anaerobic. It's going to culture pathogens. It can poison your worms. And then you think you failed at vermicomposting, and then then you give up. And that's what I want to prevent from happening. So, but back to your original point, just starting with a nice diverse mix that should have some biology already in it, is going to be, it's going to be helpful.
So shredding up a combination of 5 or 6 of these ingredients, maybe filling their container, about how deep would you recommend getting started?
I'd say it's about 6 to 8 inches is a good kind of starting depth. And then you can layer on from there.
Okay. And then you don't really start adding a nitrogen or a food source, but you're trying to get some sort of microbial life initiated in there before you order worms or find the Facebook Marketplace neighbor, that's going to donate some red wigglers to you.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because if you start with that bedding, and then what I say is, like, take an apple core or banana peel, something like that. It's gonna kickstart more of that microbial process. It's going to be this very dense source of food for the microbes to begin attacking, and it's gonna kind of start that microbial soup before the worms ever get there, because what the worms don't like is a sterile environment. So if you just took shredded paper, put it in a brand new Rubbermaid bin, stuck worms in there, they're not going to be happy. And I know, because I tried that a couple times before I figured out what I really needed. So yeah, I'm glad that you brought up, like, add some of that organic waste before you order the worms. And the one thing you cannot be that you cannot do with vermicomposting is being in a rush. If you're in a rush to save the world, you are likely going to start overfeeding, and you're going to start expecting too much out of the worms in the beginning, and you're gonna fail kind of quickly. So let's prevent that.
Yeah, go low, go slow like a worm, and you'll be all right. I want to talk about the other needs that a worm might have. I've heard and seen a lot of your videos on YouTube. Shout out to the Urban Worm Company YouTube, where you talk about grit for a worm. You talk about different food sources, both, if your worm bin gets a little big and your personal worms, like your kitchen scraps, are relatively small in that zone, what are some options you can do? I've heard of alfalfa pellets. I've heard of worm chow stuff, different grains and brands and stuff that people buy. Talk a little bit about the feeding cycle of the health of the worm, including grit and those sort of things.
Sure. So let's handle the grit separately, because it's not necessarily related to the other stuff. But worms don't have teeth. What they have is something called a crop, where they pull food, essentially suck food in, and they need to grind the food waste down before it makes their way through the rest of the digestive system. In order for there to be but there's nothing in a worm that can grind, so it needs grit. It needs to be intaking grit. So it can be things like, honestly, play yard sand is a good, sprinkle some of that stuff in there. The worms are going to bring that in. It's going to actually be that thing that grinds that food waste down inside that crop. So it can be, I would say a handful of normal soil is going to have enough of that kind of gritty material that if you sort of, as you're making that initial layer, you can add some of that stuff in if we're talking about starting the worm farm. So you do need grit, but I think you probably need a little less than what you think you do. You don't have to add grit every time that you add food. I'm a little bit lazy like that, and things seem to be working out just fine. From there, when you do your feedings, you want to make sure that you're feeding. Sometimes you can get away with feeding just food waste. It's great if it's sort of ground up, and if it's already fragmented, it means the worms and the microbes are going to be able to attack it a little more readily than just to say you put a whole apple in there and waited for it to break down. It needs the surface area exposed to the microbes and to the oxygen and stuff that's going to start the decomposition process. But is in terms of how much food waste and how much paper waste, I like to say in about a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 ratio, and that's bedding to food waste. So if you took a handful of bedding, handful of food waste, or 2 handfuls of bedding and a handful of food waste, mix them together, put them in the bin, that's going to be just fine. Now, the other stuff you talked about, alfalfa pellets and worm chow, you can use those if you feel like the worms need a bit of a supplement. If you're not creating enough food waste in your household to really feed the worms the way that you want to. But I will say that worms are not going to starve. It takes a long time for worms to starve to death. And I'm talking months. And one of the reasons why, and worms eat organic matter, and a form of organic matter is worm castings. Worms will continue to process their own poop, as gross as it sounds. But they can survive on sort of reprocessing that stuff if they need to. And so I wouldn't worry too much about it. We do sell worm chow, so there are reasons why, especially if you want to fatten up your worms, possibly for sale, or you just like these nice big chubby worms. But you shouldn't really need to supplement with anything else in most cases.
Will the appetite of a worm increase as you continue to feed it? Like besides them multiplying, you said a fat worm, is a fat worm a lazy worm, or is it an even more active worm?
A fat worm is one that's probably been fed one of those sort of plant-based but protein-rich sources like worm chow. So worm chow is one of the things that worm breeders will use to fatten worms up for sale. And one of the reasons why is a pound of worms is a pound of worms. But if you can do a pound of worms and only sell 600 fat ones versus 1,000 skinny ones, you'd probably rather sell 600 fat ones. So that is one of the motivations there. And I think that people also associate a nice big chubby fat worm with health, as opposed to maybe a skinnier one. And that's why a lot of times the worms that you'll get worms in the mail, they look nice and kind of fat. You put them in a worm farm, and then a month later, it looks like they're skinnier. Well, they probably are skinnier because you've probably not been feeding them that stuff. But it doesn't mean you don't have a healthy worm farm or a healthy worm. It's just how it is. You just got something that's a little bit skinnier. So,
interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm still interested in this conversation. So for those we may have lost along the way that are like, wow, this is really into the details and nuances of these worms, I'm totally kind of nerding out here and asking all these questions. So somebody has an established worm farm. They have happy, healthy worms. They've got grit. They have this, but they're coming in and out of seasons. It's starting to get cooler, and their opportunity is in a garage. We're in the fall right now. Let's say they have a worm farm, or they're thinking of starting a worm farm. It's starting to get cooler and cooler and cooler outside. What are their options and the best options, and what's the temperature threshold that they should be maintaining those worms at?
Worms should be kept in temperatures between 55 and about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That's kind of a wide range, and it's actually kind of the same range where humans would be reasonably comfortable. So if you think of how you would like to live, that's probably how those flesh and blood, worms are going to want to live too. So the best, starting from the most ideal, anything that you have indoors, and I especially like basements for the parts of the country that even have basements, because the temperature stays pretty cool. It's a pretty humid. It will stay close to the same temperature all year round. Aside from that, utility rooms are good. They're still in the living part of your house. There's still in some amount of air conditioning, but you mentioned garages. So a garage is a fine place in most cases, except for the hottest parts of the country. Um, you talk about, like, we're going into winter now. If you are parking your car in the garage at night, it actually provides some amount of heat that can radiate through the garage. So a garage is actually not going to be as warm as it is inside your house, but it's not going to be as cool as it is outside. And part of that is, especially if you're parking your car in there. The one thing to understand with worms and temperature is the heat kills very quickly at 95 degrees and above. It kills very slowly when you start to get down towards freezing. It just, things will just sort of degrade slowly on that lower end of the temperature spectrum, where they'll be fine, and then just dead when you get above 95 degrees. And that's really for just about any composting worm that you're talking about. So if you think of the kind of conditions where you would be reasonably comfortable, that's going to be about the same for the worm. But I realize not everybody's situation allows them to have worms inside their house, or
Right.
if they may not even have a garage.
Right.
So the one place I would say a garage is not great would be in Florida, Arizona, just places that are going to get ungodly hot during the summer.
Yeah. Death Valley,
Yep.
for all those people living there. So one of the things I've seen that people do is they get those gardening heat mats, and maybe, for our audience, a lot of them have in the winter months a heat mat they're not really utilizing for anything. Is that something that you put below to let that heat rise through? Do you set it on top so they can snuggle up like a warm blanket? How do you utilize that?
I think I have actually, it depends on what kind of bin you're using. I like using them on top of the material. And I will take one of those seed starting mats, and I think it's the best hack for getting your worm bin through the winter is to use one of those seed starting mats. If you can do one where it's got a temperature probe where it's going to turn itself off, all the better. But you can lay the seed mat right on top of the vermicompost, and it's typically going to add about 20 degrees to the ambient temperature. It's going to tend to dry out the surface of the vermicompost, which is a bit of a problem. But if you were to take a towel or one of our jute urban worm blankets, for instance, and spray a little bit of water on top, then add that seed starting mat, and then every couple days come back in, just spray the top of that towel or that urban worm blanket, and then put the seed mat back on. You should be able to get away from that problem of having a really, really dried out worm bin. That's the only downside of using those seed starting mats, is that the constant heat that they provide starts sucking away some of that moisture, and the worms are going to make their way lower into the parts of the bin where it's more moist for them. So if you can stay on top of the temperature, the seed starting mat's the way to go. I also think you could put them underneath a worm farm. And again, we're not trying to be perfect here. We're just trying to keep a worm farm going throughout the winter if we can't keep it inside. And so putting it at the bottom, heat's going to rise. It's going to radiate up through that worm farm. And that's going to be fine too. But I typically like having it just kind of right directly, on the top of the vermicompost.
Awesome. I think it's really, I've heard this over and over from you. Like, don't stress about it. It goes slow. Like, stay calm. Is there a lot of like worm panic within the worming community of like, I got to fix this quick, sort of mentality?
A little bit. I mean, when people learn about worm composting and the benefits of the worm castings, they get really excited, and they want to start now. They want to save the world now. They want worm castings right now. And they do tend to want to sort of put like a formulaic process. They say, tell me exactly how much I need to feed today. And I go, I can't necessarily tell you that. Like, what's in your worm farm right now? How's it look right now? Is there still recognizable food waste that you put in last week that hasn't been processed yet? Then don't feed. If it looks very flat, like the top of a pool table, and all you see are worm castings, well, it's probably past time to feed. So I tend not to be terribly prescriptive. And like I said in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
we are doing in buckets or urban worm bags or worm bins the same thing that worms tend to do in nature. We
Mm-hmm.
don't need to micromanage the process. I call it like you're cooking in a crock pot. You're not baking, where the
Mm-hmm.
smallest change of something makes a huge difference. So
Mm-hmm.
as long as you're giving them, organic waste at a reasonable temperature with reasonable uh, moisture, that is typically going to be enough for worms to handle things on their own. So that's kind of why I say, like,
Cool.
I try to take the mystery out of this, because there's a lot of things happening in there, but you don't need to manage every aspect of it. The worms are pretty good at doing that themselves.
Awesome. Let's talk about light. We've mentioned basements.
Mhm.
We've mentioned this. What are some light necessities for worms? At the beginning, maybe later. Let's talk about light.
Worms actually don't have worms have no need for light whatsoever. Thank goodness. They are repelled by light. They're called it's called phototaxis. There's hydrotaxis for their reaction to water, which is to be
Mhm.
attracted to it, and they've got a negative phototaxis where they move away from light, and that's actually helpful in the beginning of a worm farm, because one of the things you can do is, let's just say you've taken these worms, you put them in a new environment that they're not used to, maybe not as microbially active as you would like. One of the things you can do is leave the top off that worm farm under a bright light, and those worms are going to stay in that material. They are not going to venture out into bright light. So worms have a negative reaction to light, and it's kind of fascinating. If you took vermicompost, took a pile of vermicompost, worms, and all the good stuff that's in there, stuck it under a bright light, eventually they will just make their way deeper in there to escape that light, which is actually an effective way of harvesting worm castings. If you took some finished vermicompost, stuck it in a pile under bright light, and then just keep scraping off the top until you see worms, you're just going to end up with a pile of worms and a pile of hopefully processed worm castings.
So let's just say you're running a continuous flow, which we're going to get into right now because we talked
Mhm.
about just kind of a regular thing. You briefly mentioned the continuous flow with your worm bag. If you're in a continuous flow where you're scraping, maybe you've built a continuous flow and you've got bars holding the material in and you're
Mhm.
scraping the bottom. If you've got mildly unfinished compost and worm castings and you don't want to be scraping a bunch of worms off the bottom, can you just throw that light in there the day before or a couple days before underneath facing up? And
You
they'll
know, I
maybe
suppose
move more up?
I suppose you could, but it's not like the worms would be sitting exposed to the surface of a bottom
Right.
of the bottom. So really,
They're already
if
going to
you've
be
got,
up at the top.
they should be up at the top. But one of the things worms are attracted to is moisture. And so the reason why you might have might have worms at the bottom of a continuous flow worm bin, it probably would be helpful if we start kind of define what that is. Then it means that you've mismanaged the moisture and you've just got too much moisture at the bottom. So worms like moisture, they like organic matter. Like I said before, worm castings are organic matter. So if they've got organic matter and moisture at the bottom of a worm bin, they're going to go down there and they may not be that interested in the fresh stuff that you've put up there. So especially in a continuous flow bin, managing the moisture is key.
Ahead and go into continuous flow bin.
Right.
Describe
Yeah.
that kind of
Yeah.
through and through.
I think that would be helpful. So like I said before, composting worms tend to operate in the top 6 to 8 inches of their habitat. They in most cases like to be at the top. And so what we want to do is make sure that we've got the surface area. We're not worried about volume. We're worried about surface area when it comes to worm beds. But if you were to go try to harvest worm castings, you have to, without something that we call continuous flow, let's just say that you're using a bucket or a Rubbermaid bin, you really have to disturb that ecosystem, scrape your way down, collect the stuff at the bottom, bring it out, maybe screen it if you want to screen it or just use it in your garden. But you're going to have to essentially disturb the vermicomposting process at the top in order to get at those worm castings. Continuous flow bin, it could be an urban worm bag. If you think of it like a clothes hamper that you've got the top and then you've got an opening at the bottom, like that is a feature that is common to all all continuous flow bins. You could have more commercial scale bins like Worm Gear, formerly called Michigan Soil Works continuous flow, that has a mesh bottom with a slightly above that is a cutting bar that comes along and slices out the bottom of that vermicompost, and it drops through that mesh bottom onto the floor below. The reason why you would do this is to maintain the vermicomposting efficiency in those top layers, where all you're doing is feeding, maybe adding water, but the worms are just going to keep moving higher into those areas, and you just keep slicing off the bottom layers. And so this way you don't have to disturb that ecosystem of the worms and microbes that are working for you up top. So that could be something as simple as an urban worm bag, or something with a bit more sophistication and kind of commercial grade quality, like a Worm Gear CFT.
Yeah, and that is definitely a commercial grade. I don't think any home person's going to buy that and put it in their garage.
Probably
but
not.
hey, maybe so. Maybe we've cast the worm dream. I want to get into the output now and kind of focus into the garden side. I know I've looked at kind of a biological, I think it was an RNA analysis, or this is really throwing it back to probably like 2 or 3 years ago. I looked at this RNA analysis of the microbes and bacteria that are coming out of the worms and the value that is added there for soil health. And there's a lot of marketing materials out there for earthworm casting producers trying to sell their worm stuff to gardeners. What are you seeing there in that space, and what is this valuable output, and what makes it a good fertilizer?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up fertilizer. So worm castings, worm farmers like me tend not to call worm castings fertilizer. When you think of fertilizer in the conventional sense, you're thinking of the things that are measured in terms of NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. What worm castings have is they have actually quite trace amounts of those nutrients, but what they have are nutrient cycling microbes. That these microbes are eating organic matter, they're eating other microbes, they're eating anything that can be eaten in the soil and releasing the organically bound nitrogen that is in the soil. So nitrogen in the N form cannot be uptaken by plants as a food source. It has to be converted into nitrates or ammonium. There may be some other ones, but those are the two main ones. That's what microbes actually do. Is they're the nitrogen fixing, where they can take that N form, consume it, and then release it as ammonium and nitrates. And that is the value. It's the microbes, and it helps to have a very diverse group of those microbes too. And those microbes aren't just cycling nutrients. Some are, and this is where we're just starting to scrape the surface of what worms and worm castings can do. Worm castings, compared to compost, have a much larger, denser, and more diverse population of microbes that can perform more functions, I believe, in the soil. And I believe it's not really what I believe. I think it's something that's been kind of borne out by the research. Many of these microbes, scientists don't necessarily know what they do, but we are now able to isolate them through the DNA sequencing, where you can, because we're talking about proteins here, you can take worm castings, sequence the DNA, and understand what class, species, genus, all that stuff that you have. It doesn't mean you know what they do, but we can prove with these analyses using the DNA sequencing that worm castings are far more diverse than just manures, than really most composts, than the input material. They've done this stuff where they've analyzed the input material going into worms, and then analyze the output of the worm castings. And the worm castings themselves, due to what's happening in the worm's gut, which helps diversity and the overall population flourish and multiply, it's just showing a massively more valuable end product for the microbes. So that is really how we measure the value of worm castings. It's not going to be with the NPK value. It's going to be with how they facilitate things in the soil that can replace what fertilizer does, because they're cycling those nutrients into plant available forms.
Mm-hmm. I've heard it said like this, an old farmer described it like this. He called it worm spit. He's like, it's the worm spit that actually holds the aggregate together. And it was in reference to all that you just described, but the bonding of soil microbes for the sake of erosion and heavy rains that actually really help hold soil aggregate together. What is that worm spit? Well, and how does it? And
it's not going to be worm spit, but there is a sticky material that covers worm castings. So this hopefully nobody's eating here, but when worms excrete their little worm poop, it is covered in a sort of mucus that is itself highly microbial, and it is sticky, and it does allow for that aggregation, which is one of the reasons why worm castings do contribute to water retention in soil. And it's also one of the reasons why you don't want to use too much worm castings in soil, because you don't want too much water to be retained. Interesting, and this doesn't have to be done with worm castings. It could be done with compost, but what we're talking about is organic matter. And the fascinating part of this is that for every 1% increase in organic matter in our soil, it adds 25,000 gallons of water holding capacity in an acre of soil. I don't know how deep we're talking about, but every acre is going to be able to essentially hold 25,000 gallons. That's basically a pretty large swimming pool worth of water in the soil.
I'd have to look it up, but I think an acre inch of rain is actually like 10,000 gallons.
Yeah. So what we're able to prevent there is that runoff, where that water is running off of our farmland and into our waterways. And if this is why it's not either or. You can still use worm castings and other forms of organic matter in conventionally farmed soils, but if that water cannot be held by the soil, then a lot of that nitrogen rich stuff is being dumped into the waterways and creating algal blooms in places like Lake Erie, Lake Okeechobee. They're toxic. And so it's just another way that, all forms of organic matter, worm castings included, can help prevent that.
It's actually 27,000 gallons is the acre inch.
Okay.
So right at an acre inch is if you have 1% increase in organic matter, its water holding capacity is right at an acre inch, meaning that if you get an inch of rain, how much water are you actually capturing? All of it. You're keeping all of it, which was a reference back to my interview with Keith Burns with Green Cover, where he showed a picture of a large rain event in Nebraska where a farmer on this side of the road was using cover cropping and all these new techniques, and a farmer on this side of the road was conventional, and they had a 6-inch rain event. And this one's completely full and saturated, and this one's completely like it took it all. It absorbed it all, and it was planted. It was a crazy image. So building this, the sprinkling, because you buy you buy worm castings and they're really, really clean. There's no material. I've never been able to create a very clean earthworm casting material from my own personal worms. But if you get worm castings and you either buy them or you've started a worm bin, how do you incorporate them into the soil, and how do you use them in the soil as a gardener's sake, to where they don't dry out and you lose some of these microbial properties you're talking about?
Yeah. You're talking about application rates in somebody's soil?
Rates in practice, because if you just sprinkle on the top and you leave it dry, you're probably not going to be seeing the benefits.
Yeah, I think that look, most people, let's just take a raised garden bed, standard 8 foot by 4 foot bed that somebody might make. It's a foot deep. So we're talking about 32 cubic feet of growing medium in most cases. Most people are actually not going to create too much too many worm castings, too much vermicompost for that
Right.
garden. What I tell people is that at the maximum, you want about 5 to 10% of your soil to be worm castings. Now that's would be a lot of worm castings in a raised bed, which is why I say you probably shouldn't worry about having too much. But if you were to buy worm castings for the purpose of using them in your soil, you really want to limit it to 5 to 10% of the growing medium, the substitution rate. So again, if you had 100 gallons of soil, let's make 5 to 10 gallons of that be worm castings. As you get higher than that, as you approach 20 and 30, you start seeing diminishing returns. And then the tests that I've seen where people get over 50% worm castings, there's actually negative things that start happening. There's a little too high in salts, too much water retention. There are some plant growth hormones in some vermicomposts that actually you think a little bit is good, so a lot must be better. Well, too much plant growth hormone is actually the plant outgrows its ability to sustain itself, which interestingly enough is how Agent Orange works. Agent Orange, which was used in Vietnam as a defoliant, was really a hormone that was telling the plant, hey, grow, grow, grow. And so too much of that becomes a negative. So for somebody though that's maybe not worried about like trying to get to that 5%, what I think, and I think this is the question you were asking, is go ahead and scrape the surface of your soil, add some of those worm castings, put some of that soil back on top to kind of protect it from sun, because sunlight is probably one of the more harmful things when it comes to microbes. It's a great disinfectant, as they say, and water it in, and it kind of helps that goodness kind of leach down further in the soil. Just taking it and just throwing it on top of your soil, it's better than nothing, but you can do a much better job of protecting those microbes by trying to get them a little bit under the surface. It's kind of scratching in a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's what I was kind of referencing and looking to, because we see all these videos all over Instagram and YouTube of professional growers sprinkling what looks like earthworm castings or, earth medicine or whatever it is, or rock dust or fertilizer amendments out of buckets all over their perfect beds. And the video kind of stops there and it pans into something pretty later on, and nobody ever sees that, hey, they may have raked this in afterwards, right, or they covered it with, this landscape fabric, or like there's a process that goes one step beyond just them sprinkling the magic sauce, right?
Exactly.
And I think a lot of gardeners just kind of go out there and they go, oh, click, like I've logged it. I need to be reaching into a bucket and sprinkling something over my garden to have better results. And it's so subliminal. They're not actually thinking, oh, I have to do it one next step. And so
this is especially important in a place like Arizona. So I go out to the Arizona worm farm every year, and I see their soil. Well, their soil is covered in mulch, and it's covered in like a very wood chippy mulch, and that's by design, because if that soil is sat there exposed to that heat and that sun, you're going to lose a lot of that water and the life inside the soil due to simply dehydrating the top of the soil. So that the mulch is not as attractive to look at on Instagram as nice dark soil would be, but it's much more effective when it comes to the health of the plants that you're trying to grow.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the majority of Arizona worm farm now is all under shade cloth too.
It is. But even then, it's like there's shade cloth, but you still just have so much sun and so much heat.
They're stacking layers. You've got, holding in moisture. You've got the mulch. And are they the ones that are doing a wedge system for?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Do you want me to go into kind of the wedge?
Let's talk about the wedge.
Okay. The wedge, if you just think of, an L, you've got the floor here and you've got the you've got the wall here. That's really all you need to do what's called a continuous flow wedge. So I know we've said continuous flow, where we think of it as being like top to bottom, what sort of also could be side to side. So if you've got this wedge, what you can do is essentially take material and kind of stick it in the kind of throw it in that corner between the wall and the floor, and then just you would add worms, and then you can start slowly adding fresh organic material, food for the worms, watering the face of it, which that organic matter and the water are going to attract the worms farther out. And you just move this thing, you just keep adding to the face of it at about a 45-degree angle, and you can go for as long as you have floor space for. A few months later, you can actually come back to the wall and start scooping out what would be worm castings, processed material that you can then use or screen or both. And it is the way that they are making really all of their worm castings now. They looked at the cost benefit between buying something more expensive like the Worm Gear CFT or just doing a whole lot of wedges, and they said, you know what, it's more worth it for us to do wedges. We've got the space. I do think you lose a little bit of efficiency, but if you got the space, you're not as worried about the efficiency there. So it works for them. They are probably it's not a huge operation that they have there, but they are probably one of the largest worm wedge operations in the country.
Yeah. So if you're in Arizona and you want a very cool museum trip, you can go and look at a bunch of worms.
They do tours. You're more than welcome. I don't know if they require you to schedule it, but I think you can go out there, give them a call and ask, can I just come look at what you're doing? And they're happy. They know you'll probably leave with some some of their product anyways.
Yeah, that's very cool. Steve, is there anything I am missing in regards to this whole worm journey that somebody might be wanting to go through that I've missed talking through this?
I mean, look, there's so much you could talk about. I mean, I would say most people here are going to be more interested in kind of the home. You know, how do I do this at home? Especially if they have kids, kids love this stuff. I think we've covered really how to start the worm farm. We're starting with a container. We're putting in that carbon rich material. We're adding in then carbon rich and nitrogen rich, being the food waste material together, and essentially letting the worms do the work for them. It doesn't get much more complicated than that. You take whatever you got and you use it on whatever soil that you want to. So I don't think that there's one thing that you've been missing. I would just say, and you've heard me say this in various parts of this interview, it's like, don't worry about being perfect. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I'd rather people do vermicomposting imperfectly or not totally well, as opposed to trying to do it perfectly, trying to do it with unreasonable expectations and then falling on their face and saying, well, vermicomposting just doesn't work. That's not true. We just didn't just didn't do it correctly. So and correctly is a matter of degrees. I'd rather see you just do it imperfectly than not do it at all.
Yeah. I think I have one more question.
Sure.
As you were talking there, it totally sparked. There's a lot of debate and polarization regarding citrus fruit and oranges and pineapple and things that you should not add to your worm bin, or you should because the worms don't know the difference. What are your opinions on citrus?
I think citrus is fine. One of the things citrus peels tend to do very easily is mold. And people think that mold is a bad thing in a worm farm. Mold is just another decomposer. And so I think that you can add citrus. Most people will look at something like citrus and go, okay, well, it's acidic. So I shouldn't add it because it's going to drop my pH. Well, you're adding citrus and citrus peels for the most part, along with all this other stuff. So it's not going to really drop your pH. I think that there's all sorts of these, good all the time. Yes. Don't do this stuff, which would be like meat and dairy and cheese and just anything that was animal based. And then you've got the things that are aromatic herbs, citrus, onions, things that it's like, well, maybe do this stuff in moderation. And so, onions would be in there, like you said, pineapples. For everybody I've heard that said don't use pineapples, somebody's going to tell me I put a pineapple in my worm farm and it went just fine. So I think I don't want to give people hard and fast rules, except that they need to stay away from the non-meat, non-dairy. I think if citrus works for you, then do it. If you're doing a bin that is only citrus, that may be a problem. But if you've got citrus in with your banana peels and your apple core and broccoli and cauliflower cuttings, then use it. I do it and it works just fine.
What's the main reason behind no dairy in meat products?
I think that it will. That's a good question. I mean, I think it tends to rot. It's going to attract flies more easily. It's going to that are then going to lay their eggs and become maggots. You don't want that. I think it's just, I wish I knew the chemistry behind why. I just know that you're far better off using other alternative forms of composting, specifically bokashi. You can use bokashi, which is an anaerobic form of composting. And you can process not just meat, but you can process bones. And then you can take that stuff and then you can put it in a worm farm, which again, theory tells you shouldn't necessarily do, because bokashi is anaerobic, vermicomposting is aerobic. But if you take the stuff that you have put through one of those bokashi bins, and not to open up that can of worms for you, but you can take that material, put it in a worm farm. It's going to be reconstituted aerobically, and that becomes a good food for worms. So it's not. I just would not be putting meat in a worm farm. That stuff is just going to get nasty the way that meat smells when it gets nasty, and the smell is only part of it. I think there's other microbes and stuff that would be cultured there that we don't want in our worm farms.
So folks, it's the different style of composting that you need to close your waste streams.
Right.
Think of it that way. We're trying to close our waste stream, first, because we're trying to help, not be a part of the problem, and by not being a part of the problem, we become part of the solution. And there's one other thing that I think is a big thing all over the internet right now. What about these little countertop waste scrap machines that you see people saying you're saving the planet by putting all of your stuff in these little countertop things? What's your opinion on that?
So this is one of my hobby horses here, and of course those businesses that sell those things are probably lawyered up a lot more than I am. What they are not are composters. What they do is they grind and dehydrate food waste, and the dehydration part is key, because I've been talking about microbes. Microbes need water just like we need water in order to survive. What these machines do is overnight they will grind, heat, and dehydrate the material to where it essentially becomes inert. You look at it in the morning, it's like, oh, this looks like dirt. Well, what it really is food waste jerky to a certain extent, where it's just been dehydrated. But once you take that stuff, and if you read some of the reviews, they say, oh, I took the stuff and I put it in my garden and I watered it down, and it stunk to high heaven. I go, that's right, because it's still just dewatered food waste. So those are not composters. If you actually look at the websites for things like the Lomi or the Mill, they do not call their output compost. Lomi calls their stuff Lomi earth, and the Mill calls it grounds. And they are wise to do that, because it is not compost. And so their lawyers know enough to say, don't use that word. But they're more than happy to be associated with the idea of compost, with their product, but it's the end product's not compost.
Right. And I guess the question I would have is, it's using a fossil fuel, because it is a powered unit, to break down the material. So is it that much better than it going to a landfill? I don't know.
It looks like it's better. because it's this contained little thing. It's cleaner. One of the things people don't like about composting and vermicomposting is it can look dirty. But if you are really, if you can get beyond that, I think I can make the case that you're far better off doing composting, even if you're doing composting incorrectly or vermicomposting incorrectly. You'd be far better off than using one of those tabletop composters. Because really, let's say you're taking that stuff and you're gonna then put it in your garbage to throw away. Well, once it gets rehydrated at the landfill, goes under rain, it's going to behave like food waste again, and I believe emit methane again. So yeah. So now we're back to that. It has not gone through the composting process.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see some data on the nutrient cycling of that, of if you did add it in your garden and you did, input it as a nitrogen fertilizer, what it would actually qualify as.
I don't think it would qualify as much.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's curious. I'd like to see some data on it. That's really cool. Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time today. And if people want to know more or find you, where do they go to find stuff about you and your company?
Yeah, you can just go to urbanwormcompany.com. That's the easiest place to find me. And I think we can, with our content, we can answer a lot of questions there. And I love it if people subscribe to us at YouTube. It's just youtube.com/urbanwormcompany. All the words spelled out.
Yeah. And even if you're not interested in this and you want to support Steve because you think he's a cool dude and doing great things for the world, go ahead and go over to YouTube and subscribe anyway. You don't have to watch a video, but hit that subscribe button. It really makes a big difference in the algorithm for him. And if you're enjoying these podcast episodes, it's brought to you by Seed Time. Seed Time is a digital garden planner, which really helps you stay organized and on track in your garden. There are all sorts of new features that have been coming out over the last several years, and it is it's not just my opinion. It is such a good program for helping you stay organized, on track, increase your learning. Now with some of the new integrated AI tools, discover new layers of companion planting. It is really, really a helpful tool. There's also an AI feature that is Sprout, and you can ask any of your garden questions, and we've put the filters in to really filter out the bad advice that's out there on the internet. And it is a solid tool. So jump into your Seed Time account and check out Sprout if you haven't. Also, go to the channel, like and subscribe to How I Grow This podcast. Share it with a friend if you enjoyed this episode. And if you have worms, reach out to people who might be looking for worms in your area now. So thank you guys so much. This has been a great episode. Steve, thanks again. And we'll see you guys next time on the next episode of How I Grow This.
Man, thanks for staying tuned all the way to the end. We're so excited that you're here, and that probably means that you enjoyed what you heard and you found some value in it. If you could, go and share this with somebody that you know that really helps push it forward in the algorithm. Hit a like, a subscribe, hit a review. It makes all the difference for us. Thank you for listening to the How I Grow This podcast, and we are dedicated to bringing more of these stories to you to help you grow at the next level. We'll see you.